Our Life with Mr. Gurdjieff by Thomas de Hartmann. First published by Cooper Square Publishers, Incorporated, 1964. Published in Penguin Books, 1972. Copyright Olga de Hartmann, 1964. In 1913, there appeared in Russia, in Moscow, and later St. Petersburg, an enigmatic and extraordinary man by the name of Georgy Ivanovich Gurdjieff. Nothing was known about his past other than what was told by Vladimir Pol. Mr. Pol met Mr. Gurdjieff in Moscow through the sculptor Merkurov, whose family lived next door to Mr. Gurdjieff's parents in Alexandropol in the Caucasus. It was through Mr. Pol that P.D. Uspensky met Mr. Gurdjieff in 1915. Consequently, Mr. Uspensky abandoned his plan to return to India, hoping instead to discover through Mr. Gurdjieff the miraculous for which he was searching. In his book, In Search of the Miraculous, Mr. Uspensky writes about the years 1915 to 1920 and gives a vivid, though incomplete, picture of that period of Mr. Gurdjieff's work. During this time, Tsarist Russia was being destroyed. In this narrative, Thomas de Hartmann, who despite his youth was already a well-known composer, writes in great detail about his life with Mr. Gurdjieff from 1917 to 1929. In 1917, when the revolution made life in Petrograd, footnote, the name of St. Petersburg was changed to Petrograd in 1914 and then to Leningrad in 1924. Back to the text. Impossible, a small but devoted group of people, among whom were P.D. Uspensky and Thomas de Hartmann and their wives, followed Mr. Gurdjieff to Essentuki in the Caucasus. It was there, in 1918, that Mr. Gurdjieff founded his Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man. Civil war soon rendered life impossible in the northern Caucasus, so Mr. Gurdjieff undertook a hazardous journey over the Caucasian mountains, finally reaching Tiflis, the capital of Georgia, in 1919. Of the 12 people who took part in the expedition, only 5 followed Mr. Gurdjieff for many years. Among them were Thomas de Hartmann and his wife. In Tiflis, Mr. Gurdjieff was joined by new people, among them Mr. and Mrs. Alexander de Salzman. Soon, however, political conditions again forced Mr. Gurdjieff to move on. After remaining for about a year in Constantinople, Istanbul, and another in Berlin, he and his pupils finally reached Paris on July 14, 1922. Mr. Gurdjieff bought the Château de Prairie at Fontainebleau, Avon, where he was at last able to establish his institute on a proper scale. In December 1923, some aspects of his teaching, sacred gymnastics and music, were presented at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in Paris, and later, in 1924, in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Chicago. On his return from his first trip to America, Mr. Gurdjieff was the victim of an almost fatal automobile accident from which he recovered very slowly. During this period, he began to write, and the first drafts of his 2 books, All and Everything and Meetings with Remarkable Men, were finished in 1929. He also traveled through Europe, always taking a number of pupils with him. These were never pleasure trips. They were among the special experiences that Mr. Gurdjieff created for his pupils. Living conditions in the priory at this time became very difficult and, little by little, people left. Only a few of his most devoted pupils stayed on. A principle of Mr. Gurdjieff's method was to send his pupils, when they reached a certain stage of their work, back into the world. But not all pupils wished to leave him, so he was forced to invent such intolerable conditions for them that they were compelled to leave. In 1933, deprived by his own will of all his most devoted pupils, Mr. Gurdjieff sold the priory and installed himself in a Paris apartment. Gradually, many new people began to gather around him. Subsequently, with the help of some former pupils, new groups were organized. Mr. Gurdjieff made several trips to New York. During the last one, after World War II, he gave his consent for the publication of In Search of the Miraculous by Peter Uspensky and decided to publish his own book, All and Everything. He died in Paris on October 29, 1949, and was buried at Avon near the Chateau du Prairie. And this is a quote from Thomas de Hartmann. For a long time I have known that our interior world is the soil in which the seeds of art take root. Without this seed in which the magic part of life is hidden, and from which a work of art can be born, there is no art, there is no music. End quote. When Thomas de Hartmann met Mr. Gurdjieff in 1917, he was already an acclaimed composer in St. Petersburg. His four-act ballet, The Pink Flower, a second work for the stage with Pavlova, Forkin, and Nijinsky in the cast, was performed in 1907 at the Imperial Opera in the presence of the Tsar. His piano and vocal compositions were published and performed. He was born on the family estate in the Ukraine. He showed his inclination for music at the age of 4 and liked to express himself by musical improvisations. Fairy tales haunted him from his childhood. His father died when he was 9 years old, and his mother sent him to a military school in St. Petersburg. The director of the school recognized the boy's exceptional talent and permitted him to be free Saturdays and Sundays to study music with Arensky and Taneyev, the great teachers of the time, and piano with Esipova Leshetinsky. At 17, he graduated from the Imperial Conservatory of Music. His great desire to go to Munich to study conducted was finally realized when he met the Tsar himself at the house of the sister of the Tsar. The Tsar understood his desire to be free for his music and released him from his military obligations. He was then 21 years old. In Munich, the greatest impression made on him was not through his acquaintance with musicians, but with a group of painters, among them Kandinsky. On his return to St. Petersburg, he took an active part in the musical and social life of the capital and began work on some of his major compositions. He married Olga Arkadyevna de Schumacher, the daughter of a high dignitary in the government, and returned with her to Munich. When the First World War broke out, he was called back to St. Petersburg and soon after went to the front. From his granduncle, Eduard von Hartmann, author of The Philosophy of the Unknown, he probably inherited a longing for something unknown in ordinary life, a longing which brought him to Mr. Gurdjieff. Our life with Mr. Gurdjieff is the story of the years spent with him from 1917 to 1929. In 1929, the de Hartmanns left the Priory and finally settled in the Garches near Paris. His symphony, concertos, and other orchestral works were performed under the great conductors and on the radio, but he also had to write music for films under a pseudonym because he had lost all his fortune during the Revolution. During the Second World War, the de Hartmanns had to live in a deserted house as the Germans had occupied their own. But a piano was there, and de Hartmann could compose, though most of the time by candlelight, inspired by Verlaine, Proust, and James Joyce. He set their words to music, and all these compositions were performed in Paris and London, and later in the United States and Canada. An invitation from Frank Lloyd Wright brought them to Arizona, where de Hartmann continued to compose and gave lectures to the students at the architectural school on the interrelatedness of the arts. The last 5 years of his life were spent in New York. His music was performed and he played his works on the radio. He died in 1956 on the eve of an important concert of his music at Town Hall. Nevertheless, the concert was not canceled. In the following years, several concerts were given in New York and other American cities and in Paris. He had a considerable number of students of composition and piano in Russia, France, the United States, and Canada. And there's a note here. I write this for you so that you will not forget. and there's a passage here. Um, My great wish is that those who read this book will at once forget the epoch in which they live and will try to plunge themselves into another one more than 50 years ago, an epoch with absolutely different conditions of life, sometimes quite unbelievable now. Russia in 1917 was torn by war and revolution. Mr. Gurdjieff was an unknown person, a mystery. Nobody knew about his teaching. Nobody knew his origin or why he appeared in Moscow and St. Petersburg. But whoever came in contact with him wished to follow him, and so did Thomas de Hartmann and I, and that's signed by Olga de Hartmann. Introduction. For a long time, I wished to write about the years I spent with Mr. Gurdjieff, not just seeing him from time to time, but living with him day by day and night by night from 1917 to 1929. Although I did not see him any more after that time, he always remained my teacher. I could not write. I was afraid it would be too personal. Now I see that I am obliged to do so, especially because my wife and I are almost the only ones who left from the first years of that period of Mr. Gurdjieff's work, and also because, however small, everything concerning him is of tremendous value. Perhaps some people will not understand my reason for writing, but that does not matter. If what I have to say is not written now, it will be lost forever. Thinking especially of those who have not known him, I will try as faithfully as possible to render a living picture of Georgy Ivanovich Gurdjieff. At once a major difficulty arises. How do I do it? The outer behavior of Mr. Gurdjieff was so different on different occasions, depending on the person concerned, the level on which this person stood, and which side of him Mr. Gurdjieff wished to approach at a given moment, that it seemed as if Mr. Gurdjieff was very changeable, but it was not so. He was always the same. Only the impression he deliberately created was different. Mr. Gurdjieff wished, perhaps it was his higher task, to bring to life in ordinary man something of which man has hitherto been unaware. How he did this we can understand only from his work, about which I shall speak later. Meanwhile, I wish to stress the point that in his divine acting with people, Mr. Gurdjieff consistently followed the same line of work from the time we met him in 1917, although he always, so to speak, dressed it differently. How then can I describe him? It seems to me that the only solution is not to describe Georgy Ivanovich Gurdjieff himself, but to tell about the way he worked with us, because only by speaking of our own experiences with him is it possible to convey any idea of the work of Georgy Ivanovich and its relation to man. And that is the aim of this writing. Looking back on our life with him, I find that, little by little, all that he said and did comes to mind. Putting these memories together like parts of a jigsaw puzzle, often with a new understanding now, his ideas emerge clearly, one after another, until at last the entire tremendous picture is visible. But the ideas of Mr. Gurdjieff, when considered by people who do not actively work on themselves, are like the truth Christ expressed in the words, "Faith without works is dead." I think that the word faith here is to be understood as something rational, not as blind acceptance. And concerning the word works, it does not mean good works, and as ordinarily understood. Rather, this word has the meaning of an active, evolutionary, creative work in connection with ideas. With Mr. Gurdjieff, everything was living and active. His ideas cannot be separated from life. He himself is life, evolution. He is his work. And for me, his ideas were exemplified by his work with people. Only after all these years do I begin to understand what his work as a whole meant, and what an enormous effort he had to make to instill in us the germ of a new understanding and a new approach to life. Whether my own interpretation is absolutely correct or not, I do not know, Nor can anyone know, for only a man on the same level of being as Mr. Gurdjieff can really and fully understand the meaning of his work. Georgy Ivanovich is no longer with us, but his work with us will continue as long as we do not forget his words, "Remember why you came here."